webinar titled Demystifying Storage Types and Use Cases in Amazon Web Services. In just a moment, I'm going to hand things over to our featured presenter today. He's been a technical trainer for over 20 years and has earned nearly 100 technical certifications during his career. He specializes in virtualization and cloud technologies and is a Microsoft certified trainer, a VMware certified instructor, and an AWS authorized instructor. And on top of all that, we're honored to call him a New Horizons instructor, Sean Boland. Sean, you now have the floor.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mike, for that kind introduction, and welcome to everyone. Good morning or afternoon, depending upon what part of the world you're sitting in. Thanks for joining us today for our quick little webinar talking about some storage types and use cases in AWS. I appreciate you being here. Before I dive into the fun stuff, the technical stuff, you do notice my email address there on the slide. I do welcome follow-up email questions from you. You'll have the opportunity to put some questions here in the webinar, which we'll take at the end. But if you think of a question later on, today, tomorrow, next week, etc., feel free to shoot me a question offline. I will be happy to answer that way if appropriate. So what are we here to talk about? I'm going to start off by giving you just a very quick overview of Amazon Web Services, AWS, who they are, what they do. I assume you probably know who AWS is since you signed up for an AWS webinar, but we'll give you a very quick overview. We're then going to take a look at the idea of a use case in moving to cloud computing and why that may be one of the most important things that we ever think about in our move to the cloud. And then we are going to do a bit of a survey across some of the different types of storage that AWS can offer in the cloud. And I chose to talk about storage today because it is a prime example of where we have a lot of different types of technologies available in the cloud, all linking back to what's your use case. If someone were to ask me right now, what's the best kind of storage to use in the cloud? My answer would be definitively, it depends. All depends upon your use case. I'll end today by taking some questions, and I'll also give you a little heads up on where you can go next, specifically some classes if you want to dive in, get your hands on some of this technology and learn a little bit more. We'll tell you where to go to do that. So with no further ado, let's talk about some cool technology here. So very briefly, AWS, Amazon Web Services, been around about 15 years or so. AWS is, of course, one of the leading cloud computing platforms out there. They have quite literally millions of customers all around the world. Me saying that AWS is a leading company in the cloud computing arena, that may sound a little bit self-serving since I'm an AWS authorized instructor, but it's not just me who says that. Here I have a slide or a snippet from one of the latest Gartner surveys. And if you don't know Gartner, they're an organization that does surveys and rankings of companies and industries, kind of positioning companies out there, you know, who are the leaders, who are the followers, et cetera. This particular diagram is showing you Gartner's ratings for cloud computing providers, specifically in the infrastructure world, virtual machines and storage, as well as the platform as a service world, that's hosted applications, et cetera. And you can see Amazon Web Services way up there in the upper right-hand quadrant, indicating that they are both a leader and a visionary. The other two most close companies behind AWS, you may have heard of those, Microsoft and Google. They, of course, have their own cloud services. I think the most significant thing about ratings from companies like Gartner is they are, of course, neutral. They don't work for Google or Microsoft or Alibaba or anybody else. And they do a very complete survey across the industry. Not as a good, bad ranking, but hey, how do companies stack up with each other? If you would go back and look at the historical Gartner rankings, this is from 2020, you would see a couple of things. One, AWS being in that far upper right-hand quadrant there, You're going to see that every single year. They have firmly positioned themselves in that leader and visionary quadrant out there. The other thing you'll see is in that lower left-hand quadrant, those other companies, and some really big companies like IBM and Oracle. We've seen a lot of companies come and go throughout the years in cloud. Some have been able to be competitive, some have not. Some have gotten swallowed up by bigger companies because that's what happened. But AWS in everyone's rankings is the leader in both size, customers, services, etc. The other thing that I want to talk about very briefly with respect to cloud computing, as humans, when we think of cloud computing or we say the words cloud computing, we have a tendency to look up to the sky because that's where the clouds are at. That's not where cloud computing is at. This little diagram here, obviously a map of the world, shows where Google has, or not Google, excuse me, where AWS has their data centers out there around the world. AWS calls these regions out there. So what AWS has done effectively over the past 15 years is they've built this massive data center infrastructure around the world. And this is growing all the time. I think they have something like 5 or 7 regions that they're working on bringing online right now as we speak. The significant part of this is when you as a customer decide, I'm going to go to the cloud, I'm going to start using AWS. This infrastructure, all of these data centers, this massive network, that becomes your network. Those become your data centers as a customer. When you go out and decide, I want to build some VMs, or I want to start using some storage, or I want to run an application, you get to pick and choose from this massive global infrastructure that AWS has out there. Now, I don't know which companies all of you work for, but I'm willing to bet that none of your companies has hundreds of data centers scattered around the world, connected by high-speed, dedicated fiber optic networks with literally hundreds of thousands and millions of servers out there. But if you're an AWS customer, that is your network. So we're tapping into this massive infrastructure out there. Now, of course, if we talked about every capability that AWS has, we would be here for weeks. So what we're going to take a look at very briefly over the next couple of minutes, again, one small snippet here is we're going to look at some different technologies that AWS provides for us in the realm of storage. Again, I chose storage to talk about today because every company needs storage. Whether you're a company who runs web services or you do HR services or IT services, etc., you're storing some data. Well, if your company is looking to move over to the cloud and take advantage of that massive infrastructure that AWS has, we've got to figure out which of these storage technologies is the right one for you. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the correct answer to that question of which one is right is it depends. What does it depend upon? Your use case. Now, this scenario is one that I quote very, very often in the classes that I teach. So I have a customer come to me and they say, hey, this cloud computing thing, we've been hearing a lot about it. We think it might be good for us. We're thinking about going to the cloud. Okay, great. And so I would ask them, what exactly are you thinking about? What have you been hearing about? How do you think this is going to be a benefit to you? And the customer says, well, currently we have to buy tons of storage on premises. We got all kinds of data that we're storing. We're continuing to buy SAN and NAS devices. They're insanely expensive. It's a never-ending process. We're buying more and more and more and more. We just want to stop that. Can the cloud help us? Yes, the cloud can help you. Now, the customer told me that they think a good use case to get started in the cloud would be storage. However, I can't flip a switch and magically take that customer to the cloud, to AWS, because there's all different kinds of storage technologies. Am I going to have them use EBS, or maybe Storage Gateway is the right one, or maybe S3 is the right one? I've got to ask them some more questions. Now, I put a few sample questions out here on the slide. You see the bullet points out there. So I'm going to ask them, okay, when you say storage, we're storing data, What kind of data is it? Now, maybe the customer says, oh, yeah, when we said storage, we really meant virtual disks. Okay, we're running virtual machines on-prem, they have disks. Can we store those disks in the cloud? Okay, now we're getting somewhere specific. I could say, aha, we're onto something. Virtual disks. We're going to look at EBS, Elastic Block Storage. More on that in a moment. But what if the customer says, you know, what I really meant by storage is we have a whole bunch of NAS devices on-prem. We have some NFS storage, shared storage for a Linux environment out there. We're wondering if we could take all of that data from those NAS devices and move it over to something similar in the cloud. Can AWS do that for us? Well, thank you for asking. The answer, yeah, that would be EFS, the Elastic File System. Now, one more potential use case, because they're endless, right? So when I ask that customer, okay, tell me a little bit more. What do you mean by storage here? They say, oh, what we really meant was on-prem, we have tons of Windows file servers. And those servers are getting old. They host all kinds of shared folders, people's home directories and application shares, et cetera, et cetera. We're looking either buy new servers, upgrade Windows, or go to the cloud. Well, again, the customer now has given me some very specific information. They want to do Windows shared folders in the cloud. So once again, we can do that. AWS has a technology called FSx, which is effectively Windows file services in the cloud. So the idea of a use case in going to cloud computing is unbelievably important. Now, we're using storage as our example today. We could also be talking about compute and virtual machines, or we can be talking about databases or application services. We can be talking about any one of those. We're talking about storage today. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to talk very briefly, of course, about some of these different kinds of storage technologies. What is it? Why do you care as a customer? And what might you potentially be using this for? Remember, this is not a good, bad discussion. This is, what is your use case? Here's the technology we're going to use to help you fulfill that. So the first item up for bid here is EBS, Elastic Block Storage. Quite simply put, these are virtual disks. If you're going to be building virtual machines, VMs in the cloud, and those of you who are system admins, you guys know what VMs are. If you're going to build VMs in the cloud, virtual machines need virtual disks. In AWS, the storage technology that we use to create and manage virtual disks, whether they're 2 gig in size or 2 terabytes in size, is a technology called Elastic Block Store. These work pretty much exactly like a virtual disk does in an on-prem scenario. If you're building virtual machines in VMware vSphere or Hyper-V, et cetera, VMware's technology to do that is EBS. Really doesn't matter what the virtual machine is doing, whether it's a Windows VM, a Linux VM, if it's running a SAP HANA scenario or a database, we're going to use EBS. When we set up EBS, we can say, how big do I need the disk to be? 20 gig, 20 terabytes, well, whatever it happens to be. And we can also define performance characteristics. What kind of IOPS do I need? IO operations per second. How fast does a disk need to be? Again, there are graduated options out there that you can choose from. Our next storage technology here, and again, we're just going to transition from one to the other here. They're all different. File shares. If you have on-prem data that is some kind of a file share, now it could be a Linux or a Unix share. That would be the NFS protocol. My Linux and Unix admins know what that means. Or it could be a Windows share, that's the SMB protocol. Well, either one of those scenarios, the answer in AWS is yes. EFS, the Elastic File System, is an AWS service that allows us to create NFS-based shares. So I got a bunch of Linux machines. They need to connect to an NFS share. Elastic File System does that. If we are looking for file shares, but we're looking for the Windows variety, SMB shares, well, the service we would stand up and utilize is a service called FSX. That's the ability to create Windows shared folders directly in the cloud. Don't have to build servers. I can just create the shares in the cloud. Now, this can integrate with Active Directory. We can set permissions on them, etc. So you don't lose anything when you go to the cloud. It's just you're using somebody else's storage. Again, different use cases, different technologies. Now, before I go any further, I do want to mention something out here. If you're going to be looking at going into cloud computing, you have a whole other vocabulary that you are going to be learning. AWS has somewhere north of about 300 individual services right now. Each service is made up of individual pieces of technology, and of course, they all have unique names. So there is a bit of a learning curve that everyone goes through, me, you, everybody else. And part of that learning curve is just starting to digest and remember which service does what, remembering that service name. That's not something you're going to remember immediately. Okay, I don't remember something the very first time I hear it. You hear it once, twice, 3 times. Now it starts to soak in. What if the customer tells me, well, on-prem, we have some backups that we run. Everybody does backups, right? And currently we're storing that data on-prem and some different storage appliances, et cetera, but we're tired of buying storage, et cetera. We just want a place to take data generically. It could be backups, maybe it's log files. We just need a place to plant that data and archive it. Now, we might go in and look at it. We might need to pull a backup or something like that, or we might need to look at a log file, but we need a type of storage where we can pretty much plant any kind of data and use it either for production purposes, long-term archival purposes, etc. Well, AWS has that. In fact, this is one of the oldest services that AWS has. It was literally the second service that AWS started selling for customers. It's called S3. S3 is short for the Simple Storage Service. In the Simple Storage Service, you create what's called a bucket. Now, AWS uses that construct of a bucket because it's really easy to understand. When I create a storage bucket in the S3 service, I can dump any kind of data I want to in there. S3 doesn't care. Doesn't care if it's JPEG files, doesn't care if it's log files, Excel spreadsheets, files from my backup program, whatever. It doesn't care. Now, here's the analogy for you. If you go to the hardware store this afternoon and you buy a bucket and you take it home, you can put anything you want to in the bucket. The hardware store really doesn't care what you put in that bucket. You can put water, dirt, rocks, it doesn't matter. Well, same thing with S3. You just need to store some data, archive some data, etc. You can do that. With Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive, those are just variations of S3, you can actually get some incredibly low storage costs because with those services, you're telling AWS, this is archive data. I just need to put it out there. I need to save it. Compliance says I need to save it for 15 years or whatever. I'm never going to look at it. So because you're not going to be actively accessing that data, pulling it in or out, Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive can give you some really, really, really low storage rates to save you money. Again, different use case, different technology. Sounds like a common theme now, doesn't it? Now, storage gateway. When we talk about cloud computing, you will very often hear people talk about what we call a hybrid cloud. Now, let me demystify that term for you. Hybrid cloud is just where you're going to keep some of your stuff on premises in your local physical data center, and you're going to move some stuff over to the cloud. Maybe it doesn't make sense to move everything to the cloud. Maybe you're not ready to move everything right now, et cetera. But we want to work kind of in both environments. That's hybrid cloud. Well, what if that hybrid cloud scenario includes discussing storage? The customer tells me, okay, I've got this data that my servers access on premises. And I'm not going to move my servers to the cloud yet, but I'd like to take the data and have it replicated out to the cloud. I have the data in two places. That's good, disaster recovery, etc. But maybe someday when I do take my servers and move those over to the cloud, I'll be able to point the servers at the cloud data. So I want the data both on-prem and in the cloud. And oh, by the way, it's got to continuously sync. Well, what I just described for you is a use case for a product called Storage Gateway. Storage Gateway is either a virtual appliance or a physical rack-mounted appliance that you're going to put in your data center, and it will facilitate the sync or the copy of data from on-prem out to the cloud. There's several different variations depending upon how you're using the data, tape gateway, file gateway, etc. But it's a synchronization appliance out there, enabling that hybrid cloud scenario. What if you just need to copy some data? So I'm on-prem now, I'm gonna go to the cloud, or maybe I experimented with another cloud provider, or maybe I have some data at a remote data center and I just need to do a data movement. I need to do a data copy. Well, notice the definition of this service right here, AWS Data Sync. If I just read directly from the slide, it says is an online data transfer service that simplifies, automates, and accelerates moving data between on-prem storage systems and AWS, as even between AWS services out there. Now, I'll often have customers and students say, well, wait a minute. You just mentioned Storage Gateway and you said it's going to sync data. And now you're talking about something else called Data Sync and you said it's going to sync data. What's the difference? Purpose is the difference. Storage Gateway is what I would be utilizing if I wanted an ongoing synchronization. I'm going to leave my servers on-prem. They need to access the data on-prem, but I want to copy out in the cloud too. And that's going to be an ongoing scenario. Storage Gateway is used in that ongoing scenario. If you have a one-time data copy, whether it's from on-prem to the cloud, cloud to cloud, service to service type of thing, not an ongoing scenario, the data sync service is what we're going to be using for that. So again, they're both data copying, data moving solutions, but they're used for different purposes out there. Now, when my customer says, okay, I'm going to be using this service in the cloud, maybe it's S3 or something like that, whatever it comes out to be. I'm going to say, okay, how much data do you have on-prem that we need to get to the cloud? Now, if they say some small trivial amount of data measured in megabytes or gigabytes or a low number of terabytes, we can probably reasonably copy that data across the network using services like DataSync. But what if my customer describes dozens or hundreds of terabytes? What if they start talking about exabytes of data? We probably can't move that much data across a network connection and have it get there in a reasonable amount of time. I mean, you've only got so much bandwidth coming out of your data center, right? I don't think any of you have unlimited bandwidth out there. And even if you do have a giant amount of bandwidth, do you want to suck up all that bandwidth for weeks copying data over? Well, what I'm describing for you is a use case where we really need some off-network or some external physical movement of data. So AWS has an entire range of devices, physical devices. We refer to these as the Snow family. And for those of you who are Game of Thrones fans, I'm not talking about Jon Snow's family. Sorry. Okay, we are talking about some physical storage appliances. In fact, I even have a picture of one of them. Let me bring it up here really quickly. I went out on Google and did a search here. These are some examples of what's called a snowball device. It is a physical storage appliance that I will order from AWS. They will ship it to me. I will plug it in my network. I will dump my data on there. It's a secure device, it's encrypted, etc. Depending upon how much data you have to move, there are different sizes of devices. That's why I call it the Snow family, small, medium, large, extra large kind of a thing. I dump the data on the Snowball device. I call the shipping company back. They come and get it. Again, it's an encrypted, rugged device, etc. Shipping company takes it over to AWS. AWS plugs it in and dumps it into my account wherever I tell them to. They could dump it into S3. They could dump it into EFS, FSX, wherever I tell them to dump it, they're going to dump it. Now, probably not a scenario where you're going to be ordering a different Snowball device every week, more to the point of when we have that giant migration of data that we just can't copy it across the network in any reasonable amount of time, there's a solution for that too. All right, just a couple more to go through here. This one is probably the most unusual storage scenario. In fact, if you went out to AWS and just did a search for AWS storage types, this one might not even show up, but I put it in here. Elastic cache. So the operable term here is caching. So this is a very, very specific kind of storage. Let's say that in AWS, you are running a database. Now, don't really care what kind of database you're running. Could be Microsoft SQL, could be Oracle, could be MySQL, whatever. Pick your favorite database flavor. So one of the ways that we make databases faster is by using caching technology, specifically in-memory caching. When a database needs to retrieve data from a disk, disks are relatively slow. Yeah, we can buy fast disks, but disks are relatively slow. We can speed up databases or accessing the data on a database by taking some of the data that database commonly needs and moving that into an in-memory cache. If I can keep my most commonly hit data in a in-memory cache, when that data needs to be read, we're reading it from RAM instead of reading it from a disk. Ta-da, my database just got faster. Well, that's exactly what the Elastic Cache service is. Again, this is an extremely specialized scenario. You may never have a use case for this, but that's okay. When we have that scenario where I need to push the envelope of my database performance, and doing so with an in-memory cache of data is the way to do that, I'm gonna look up the Elastic Cache service and be able to stand that up. Again, it's a managed service. AWS is going to help me stand it up. How much space do I need? What kind of caching engine do I want to use? We can use Redis, we can use Memcached. There's different caching engines out there. Again, I put this under the storage types. Not everybody does. A lot of people just lump this into talking about databases, but hey, we're actually storing some data out there. It's just storing it in RAM. Different use case, different technology. All right, getting down to the end here. Can't talk about data storage without talking about backups. So one of the realities of cloud computing, and this is true of AWS, or if you go look at other cloud vendors, it's true of them. You as a customer are responsible for your data, for your applications. If I take my super important production data and I move that data over to AWS, if something happens to that data becomes corrupt. Data can corrupt. My application goes nuts and it eats the data. My application accidentally deleted all the data. That's my responsibility. It's my data. I'm in charge of it. Yeah, I'm using AWS's resources to store that, and they're responsible for the hardware, but I am ultimately responsible for my data, just like in an on-prem scenario. So IT 101, if data is important to you, you're backing up that data, right? By the way, yes would be a good answer to that question. So in an on-premises scenario, we would be looking at, well, okay, let's go shopping for our backup vendors. What kind of data are we backing up? How do we want to store the data? And we go out and we look at Commvault and Veeam and all the other backup companies out there, Rubrik, et cetera. There's a million of them. Well, Now my data's in AWS. Still my responsibility to back it up. Now, there are lots of third-party companies that make backup products that can plug into AWS. So you may already use a backup vendor, again, Rubrik or Commvault or Veeam, those are just ones that pop into my head right now. You may be able to look at that vendor you already use and they go, oh yeah, we can back up stuff in AWS, no problem. Okay, great. Well, if not, guess what? AWS has a backup service. Now, I can use the AWS backup service to basically back up any kind of data in AWS, whether it's in S3 or EFS or FSX or whatever, name the storage service. I can back up that data. And then one of the things that I can do is I can tell the backup service where to put my backups. Remember that globe picture I had up earlier with all the AWS data centers all over the place? I won't bring it up again. If my original copy of my data is in the Ohio region, that's where I've got all my stuff, I may use the AWS backup program, not only to have a backup, because I'm a good admin, I want a backup, but I want to back up that data and I don't want to keep it in the Ohio region. What if the entire state of Ohio explodes? Sorry, Ohio, you exploded. I want to take that data that's in Ohio, I want to back it up to the Northern California region or the Virginia region, or pick your region, whichever one you want to go to. So now not only am I backing up my data because I'm a good admin, but I'm also backing up my data effectively off-prem, backing it up to another data center out there. Again, there are lots of third-party companies that can plug into AWS for backups, but if you don't have one, AWS has a backup service. Now, I've taken a couple minutes of your time talking about use cases here, talking about specifically storage services, and the message here is, it depends. It depends upon what your use case is. None of this has been a yes, no. None of this has been a good, bad. This has been, it depends. And by the way, there's other storage types out here, and there's variations of storage types. Within S3, there's like 5 different levels of S3 that I could use depending upon my use case out there. So what happens next? If you're thinking about going to AWS, or maybe you've started to use AWS and your eyes are about this big because there's a million things out there you can use, you're like, uh-oh, how am I going to learn all this stuff? Well, New Horizons is an AWS authorized training provider. We deliver authorized AWS courses. I am an AWS authorized instructor. I may not be your instructor if you take a course. We have other instructors, but I may be. AWS has dozens of courses that are available. Now, I've listed a handful of them here. If you were just starting out, not gone to the cloud yet, thinking about going to the cloud, wanting a little bit more about the cloud, etc., one of the 2 introductory classes would be appropriate for you. These are one-day classes, basically 8 to 4 or whatever time frame it runs. What we do is we take an overall look at the cloud, look at different technologies, compute, storage, network, etc., just kind of giving you some information about things, not a ton of technical detail, because we can't do a ton of technical detail in one single day, but kind of get you started. The Cloud Practitioner Essentials is a class that was specifically created both for IT people and non-IT people. What if I'm a business owner or manager and I kind of want to get my mind wrapped around this? Cloud Practitioner Essentials is good for that. Technical Essentials, key word here being technical, this is a one-day intro class that's designed for techies, for geeks like me. The difference between these 2 classes, labs. Technical Essentials says, hey, let's talk about some of this stuff, give you some overview information, but oh yeah, we'll give you some labs to play with it as well. Cloud Practitioner Essentials, since it's designed for that non-IT person, no hands-on labs. Now, once we get that under our belt, or maybe you're already using AWS, you're like, I don't need a one-day intro class. The associate level classes are 3-day classes, and I've listed the 3 most popular here. I would ask you, what's your purpose? What are you trying to learn? Now, if you told me, I'm a developer, I'm a programmer, well, obviously we're going to put you in developing on AWS because that's a class specifically designed for programming technology. The fact that it's a 3-day class, we can obviously go into much more technical depth, much more depth, hands-on labs, etc. The system operations on AWS, that is for the traditional sysadmin. That's me. I'm a sysadmin guy. So what are technologies I can use for monitoring? What are technologies I can use for automation? Things like that. The most popular class that AWS has, hands down, is this guy right here, Architecting on AWS. It is a balance between learning things from a technical perspective with hands-on labs, but the reason we call it architecting is you learn about the AWS architecture. It's a fairly general course. We talk about compute, we talk about network, we talk about databases, we talk about storage. So there's a little bit of something in there for everybody. But the reason it's the most popular class, and most people start there after an introductory class, is it gives you the broadest technology base in learning how AWS works, all the services work, hands-on labs, etc. From the architecting on AWS, then you can jump into the more advanced classes or the specialized classes. And again, I've only listed a few of them here. There's classes on databases, if you're doing containers, if you're doing big data, if you're doing machine learning, if you're doing artificial intelligence, there's classes on all of that out there. I've just put some of the basic ones here. And then just so you know, it's not a one and done scenario like most technology companies and training providers. There's a graduation. So for instance, if I'm a developer, I might start off in Tech Essentials, then I take developing on AWS, and then maybe I graduate up to DevOps engineering, which is where we're getting into that continuous integration, continuous development kind of an environment. Maybe we're getting into containerized or Kubernetes-based services, et cetera. So there's always that kind of a graduation out there. And again, small sampling, several dozen classes that are available from AWS there. All right, so I'm going to stop and take a breath and ask if there are any questions that have come in.
Awesome, thank you, Sean. And as Sean mentioned, if you have any questions, please just take a moment to type them into the questions box and we'll get to them shortly. And if anybody's interested in the material presented in this webinar, or if you have questions regarding available course offerings, please contact your local center for further information. You can log on to newhorizons.com and do a zip code search for the center nearest you. Our webinar schedule is also up to date on our website at the www.newhorizons.com. Just click on the webinars link to view the full schedule and register for any upcoming sessions. And just as a friendly reminder, we will be sending out the recording link to today's webinar later today. So Sean, here's my first question. If I want to sync repeatedly, but at discrete times, would I use data sync for that or storage gateway?
Yeah, great question. Storage gateway. Anytime you have an ongoing need for synchronization out there, storage gateway is the answer. The data sync is more the one time. And with storage gateway, you do have control as to, whether that's a continuous, I'll call it real-time sync, or maybe you only want to do the sync after hours. Storage gateway allows you to configure that schedule however you want to do that.
Great. And I think you addressed this somewhat, but there's a question, do courses include hands-on labs?
Yes, I will say 99% of the courses have hands-on labs. I'm racking my brain right now. The one class that does not have hands-on labs definitively is Cloud Practitioner Essentials. Again, that's designed for both the technical and non-technical, so it is lecture and demonstration. All of the other classes, including Technical Essentials, have hands-on labs. And generally, there is a hands-on lab for each module that we go through. So for instance, in the architecting class, we start off talking about virtual machines, compute, and then there's a lab on virtual machines. Then we go to storage and there's a lab on S3. So yes, they're all hands-on intensive. And I would say overall, in most classes, it's about a 50-50 balance between lecture and demo and lab. So pretty hands-on intensive.
Great. And can you tell me about how courses align with AWS certifications?
Yes, perfect question. So AWS has a full certification program. I did not put this website link out there, but it's a really easy one, so I'm just going to tell you. If you go to http://aws.training, that will get you into the AWS certification structure out there, and AWS has a multi-layer certification program. Not every class aligns to a certification. However, when you look at the introductory classes, those align to the Cloud Practitioner certification. If you look at the associate level classes, each one of those associate level classes aligns specifically to a certification. And then when you get to this professional level, each one of those aligns to a certification. So not every class aligns to a cert, but the ones that do, it's basically one class to align to one certification. It's a 1-to-1 mapping there. And the other cool thing that AWS does is the certifications have the same name as the courses do. So if I look at the Architect Associate class, it would be the Architecting on certification, it would be the Architecting on AWS class. If I look at the Architect Professional certification, it'd be the Advanced Architecting. So they aligned the names there to make that easy as well.
Great. There's kind of a follow-up question to this. If people take the class, do they typically, or do you recommend that they take the certification exam right after the class, or is it better to have time to practice in between?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, I will tell you, different people have different opinions on this. So I'm gonna give you my opinion. No. These certifications are pretty technically challenging. They're not impossible, they're not easy, they're kind of right in the middle. It is incredibly rare in my experience for someone to sit through a class for 3 days, absorb everything they need to know, and take the test on the next day. I basically never advise that. I think at a very minimum, you would want to take a look at some practice tests, and AWS has practice tests. AWS has outlines for all their exams. Here's what you're going to be tested on, et cetera. One of the things we do in the classes is we'll give you kind of a breakdown of the certification. Yeah, here's what's going to be covered on the cert. Here's what you should be studying. And then we give recommendations for practice tests and practice labs. So I always think that take the class, now take some time to prep, then take the test. Whether you prep for 2 days or 2 weeks or 2 months, that depends on your experience, but I never recommend class followed by exam the next day. I wouldn't do that personally.
Wonderful, wonderful. That's all the questions we've had come in. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us, Sean? We have a couple of minutes here.
I don't think so specifically. I gave my email address earlier, sbolin@omahanh.com. I've got that on the last slide out here. If you didn't think of a question now and you think of one later, you wake up in the middle of the night with the question, send me an email. I'm always happy to take those out there. The one thing I will say for everybody, when you are looking at cloud computing, especially with AWS, there is an enormous amount of things you can do in the cloud. AWS has over 300 individual services now. Everybody does a lot of self-training, self-learning. I do it. You look up stuff on the web, you teach yourself, etc. It really is worth investing, at least in the beginning, getting some of those foundational classes, those foundational skills to understand enough so that when you do your self-training, self-education going forward, you have a really good base to work from out there. I did that. I have to learn stuff just like everybody else does. And when I started getting into cloud computing and AWS, I took some classes. And again, that base of knowledge that you get up front, that can pay huge dividends down the road when you go to set stuff up.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you, Sean. As you mentioned, AWS can be very confusing. There are a lot of parts to it, so really appreciate you clarifying that for us. And this concludes today's session. So thank you for joining us. And Sean, thank you again for your expertise. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure as always. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.